each individual had really his own reason for enlisting in the Army, and you see it across the board. But a lot of immigrant groups did enlist. There were famous Irish regiments, there were German regiments, German-speaking regiments, Norwegian regiments. So I think that's something very unique to the Civil War story, that you look at the way the Army is put together today, it's not all local like it was during the war. If your regiment went into a particularly hard fight, like at Gettysburg, and you had those high casualty rates, local towns could be decimated because the male population was all serving in that particular regiment. Everyone knew that, and it could be devastating to a town, municipality, if there were high casualty rates. You can bet that your town was going to be affected by that.
Home life changed for Wisconsinites as it did for most Northerners. I mean, they're far from the fighting, even farther than most. What does change, of course, is that soldiers are about 1/9 of the population of Wisconsin. That's a huge number of people leaving. Some of them are husbands. They're all brothers or sons, or again, some are fathers. And so there's kind of a hole in the economy. This is a largely agricultural economy at that time. And so you have men going off and leaving their farms in the hands of either hired men, of older sons and daughters, of wives. And so I think that's probably the most common experience of non-combatant Wisconsinites, is just to have to replace the labor of a father or a son or a brother.
I think a lot of people think that women working outside of the home is a World War II phenomenon. There's the famous poster, the Rosie the Riveter poster that came out of World War II. But really, it's the Civil War, when women are first working outside of the home. You think about such a large percentage of the population, the male population, is leaving the state to go serve as a soldier, to leave. And these women had to step in to keep the family farms or the family businesses running. They had to make a living, they had to take care of their family, they had to survive. And so really, for the first time, these women are stepping outside of their normal role, which would have been as a wife or a mother in the household, and working outside the home in a business or environment. So I think that's pretty unique to the Civil War story.
I think another way that the war affected the Wisconsin home front would have been the need to raise money for the Army. As in all places, civilians really took it upon themselves to, at one level they knitted socks, they sewed clothes, or they sent boxes of goods to soldiers. We think of our Army being really well equipped, and not just in guns and ammunition, but in clothes and food and so forth. That was not the case in the Civil War. It's a very understaffed Army. There aren't a lot of even medical supplies. The Army gets big really fast, and it's hard to keep up with that. And so families would send extra clothes and extra money and extra food to soldiers. Organizations. There's one called the Westside Soldiers Aid Society. When the Westside then meant more like right about where we are now in the Westside downtown. And they were among the more well-known groups that had a sort of a coherent way of raising money and food and supplies. And so they would have bazaars and sales, and they were part of a larger effort called the United States Sanitary Commission, which was a federally chartered organization headed up in New York that had branches around the country, which collected they were mainly raising money to buy supplies. They actually hired doctors and nurses. There's a hospital ship they funded off the coast of Virginia for part of the war. It was meant to be a very organized approach to not only those kinds of medical necessities, but cleaning up camps. Sanitary referred to getting the camps more sanitary. And so there were a lot of people involved there.
A lot of people think that the battles were all out east, and what could it have possibly meant to people in Wisconsin? Here we were on the frontier. Wisconsin had only been a state since 1848, so 12, 13 years before the war starts. So we're a relatively young state, relatively new state. If you look at the records, just because there are no battlefields within maybe a short drive of Wisconsin, it doesn't mean that Wisconsin men didn't participate heavily in the war. over 90,000 men from Wisconsin enlisted and fought for the Union Army. So I think that's part of the story that often is overlooked, is the sheer numbers that came out of Wisconsin. But beyond that, it was, Wisconsin supplied a lot of the natural resources and foodstuffs that made the war effort possible. If you think about the lead mines over in southwest Wisconsin, they were mining galena lead that was used to make the bullets. You know, heavy timber industries in northern Wisconsin, trees cut down, used to make cannons and wagons and gun stocks and all those things. Wisconsin was a huge grain producer, so they would produce these grains, send them to cities like Milwaukee or Chicago that would then transport that food, process it, and send it to the men at the front, be used as food. So the raw materials, not besides just the sheer number of men that came out of Wisconsin to fight, these raw materials were very important to the Union war effort.
The lumber industry was just beginning to peak, though there was some lumber operations. So its main crops tended to be wheat. It was one of the great wheat producing states, and in fact, in the course of the Civil War, it went from like 4 or 5 to the #1 wheat producer at a time when wheat sold for like 40 cents a bushel. It went to like $3 a bushel, which literally, you know, pumped Wisconsin's economy sky high. There's other things as well, leather for uniform parts and belts and buckles and badges and all those things. Animals, mules, horses were sold. Sheep turned into food, the raising of hogs for different foodstuffs. In the mid-90% of families were involved in farming of some sort. But as that began to, we're right on the edge of that industrial revolution, they begin to produce, you know, harnesses and wood carriages and all those things that go into the making of firearms, and, you know, barrels to move pork and other meat stuffs and all of that thing. So you begin to see a small industrial change. You know, the world we live in has come out of that period of the Civil War. I'm not sure people recognize all that. They think of battles, and yet the social change in Wisconsin was much more significant. It made us a modern state in many ways, and, you know, we were proud of what we did as soldiers, and of course that hangs on until, I think, even today. So it's an interesting period.
Along with the resources that came out of Wisconsin, the state was also the home of many important regiments that fought in the Army of the Potomac. Soldiers from Wisconsin fought in many major battles, including Gettysburg, Bull Run, and Antietam, and traveled all around the states. At the end of the war, one regiment from Wisconsin was responsible for capturing Jefferson Davis, who was the President of the Confederate States. Throughout the war, a few regiments from Wisconsin became well known for their fighting ability, and they became known as the Iron Brigade.
If you look at where Wisconsin regiments fought, they fought all over the country. And a lot of people think, oh, the Civil War, that's something that occurred between Richmond and Washington, D.C., you know, in Northern Virginia and especially on the East Coast. But if you look at where Wisconsin regiments went, you've got regiments west of the Mississippi serving in Arkansas and in Louisiana and in Missouri, along the Mississippi River, in Tennessee. So these troops from Wisconsin really served all over. In every theater of the war, both the Eastern Theater and the Western Theater.
Of course, the Iron Brigade, which was the 2nd, 6th, and 7th Wisconsin, which was brigaded with the 19th Indiana, and much later after Antietam with the 24th Michigan. These were all what were considered Western regiments in the time of the Civil War, because we were on the real edge of the frontier. So these regiments were shipped east into the Army of the Potomac, and they were the only all-Western brigade in the Army of the Potomac, and of course that immediately was enough to cause a fight with anybody, because they were very proud of their states and very quick to defend their reputation. So they became a very strong fighting force.
So when this all-Western brigade, these 3 Wisconsin and 1 Indiana regiments went east, the Pennsylvania and New York regiments, they were a real curiosity. What were they like? What were these Westerners like? And they proved to be really good soldiers, very good soldiers, served at South Mountain and Antietam and at Gettysburg was really, those three battles were, they suffered heavy casualties, but they became one of the most famous brigades in the entire Union Army.
They were kept out of the war for almost a year due to a series of circumstances. And it was during that time they were brigaded by a man named Rufus King, who was the general of the first of the regiments, and later by a man named John Gibbon. Gibbon was a Philadelphian, or actually was born in Pennsylvania, but he grew up in North Carolina. Three of his brothers went into the Confederate Army, but he stayed with the Union. He was a professional, a West Pointer, artilleryman, and he literally, in a period of 6 months, turned these rather rowdy Western boys into a pretty good fighting force, and then they became engaged for the first time late in August of 1862. It's like almost a year from the time they reached Washington. And when that happened, they ended up fighting Stonewall Jackson in a place near the old Bull Run battlefield, and they marched out outnumbered 3-1, and they stood for 90 minutes in an open field, duking it out with Stonewall Jackson's veterans. And it was a horrific fight. They were at ranges of 50 to 60 to 70 yards apart, and they stood up and fought Jackson to a standstill. The fighting only ended when it became too dark to see their enemy.
They fought shortly thereafter in September 14th in Maryland, in western Maryland, the Battle of South Mountain. And they were fighting at dusk up the side of the mountains there. And the commanding general of the Union Army of the Potomac, General McClellan, was watching the men fight up the side of the mountain. And legend has it that he turned to one of his staff and said, "Who are those men?" And the answer came back, "It's General Gibbon's Westerners." And McClellan said something to the effect of, "Well, they must be made of iron to fight like that." And that's really how the nickname Iron Brigade got started. They went on to fight 3 days later at Antietam, suffered heavy casualties there, and then later on in the war, July 1st, 1863, the first day's battle at Gettysburg, one of the regiments that had been added, because the original 4 regiments were so decimated by wounds and injuries, they added the 24th Michigan to the brigade. They were promised the next Western Brigade, so these Michigan men came along and were added to kind of replace a lot of the numbers they had lost. Well, the Michigan men that July 1st lost nearly 80% of their men as casualties at the Battle of Gettysburg. And when you say casualty, that means killed outright on the battlefield, captured, missing, or wounded. So it's not all killed in battle, but 80% was the highest casualty rate on the battlefield that day.
We tend to see pictures of armies in uniform, they all look the same. That's not necessarily the case. There are different versions of this. And so they looked different, they fought well, they had really good commanders. The 6th Regiment of Wisconsin Volunteers, for instance, has a moment at Gettysburg at the railroad cut, they call it. There's this part of the battlefield. They decimate a Confederate regiment on the first day of that battle. And so it just becomes this famous regiment. They fight it's an unusual Western brigade in the Army of the Potomac, which fights mainly in Virginia, but of course at Gettysburg as well in Pennsylvania. And so they're sort of in the most famous army with the most famous commanders. They're in the big battles, and they do really well. Hence they're named the Iron Brigade, or those damn black hats they're referred to sometimes. I think of all the Wisconsin units, they're probably the famous one.
They were in like 4 major battles in the course of three weeks. During that time, they lost 50% of their members. And it was during that time that they became famous as the Iron Brigade. They were originally called the Black Hat Brigade because they wore these tall, I like to say pilgrim hats because people know what those are. They were the dress hat of the U.S. regulars, but they didn't have enough hats to go around, so they went into everybody wanted those little flat kepis and forage caps that are so stylish. And they didn't have enough of those to go around, so they went in, and because we were from Wisconsin, the regiments were from Wisconsin, they had nobody to speak for them, so they went into the old equipment and dug out these old hats, and that's where that name came from. And they fought all through the war. heavy fighting in Antietam, which is of course the bloodiest day of the war, and they opened the fight, infantry fighting at Gettysburg, and literally fought through the rest of the war. At the end of the Civil War, when all was, when they were tallying up all these numbers and trying to put together, of the 400 top fighting regiments in the Union Army, the one with the highest percentage of casualty losses was the 2nd Wisconsin. The brigade with the highest number of losses was the Iron Brigade. So their reputation, there was a pretty good fighting brigade. And so it's a lot. So that's you know, that's an interesting part of history. A lot of people don't remember that today. Actually, Highway 12 in Wisconsin is now called the Iron Brigade Highway, US 12. So they go on and on.
Soldiers throughout the Civil War used different types of equipment and firearms. With us today is William Bodeau, an accomplished author of the Iron Brigade and is an avid Civil War firearms specialist. Thanks for being here, William.
You're welcome.
So you brought with here a recreation of an Iron Brigade uniform. Tell me a little bit about the uniform.
Well, the uniform, as mentioned, was essentially the regular Army uniform pre-war, which was adopted by the brigade commander. It consisted of a 9-button frock coat that came down just to the knees, and the regular Army black hat, to which were affixed the numerals of the regiment and company. There's a photo here of a Civil War veteran who died in battle with the Iron Brigade, and you can see how that uniform is arrayed. In addition, the men carried cartridge boxes, of course, which carried the ammunition, a waist belt and cap box, a haversack in which many personal items were stored, and a bayonet and scabbard. Canteen, obviously, for water. Initially, there were knapsacks issued that they carried on their back, but the men stripped down and became very practical and carried bedrolls in which they rolled spare clothing and that sort of thing.
What was the most common rifle used during the war?
Most common rifle used was a rifle musket, which stood almost 5 feet tall, which means that it was about shoulder height for most men. It was a .58 caliber, fired what was called a mini ball instead of a round ball, and that was developed sometime around the Mexican War, about 10 or 12 years before. There was a standard procedure to load. It was called load in 9 counts. The men would withdraw a cartridge in which this ball, mini ball, and powder were wrapped together in paper. The men would tear open the paper with their teeth, which required, of course, that they have a full set of teeth to be in the Civil War. Pour the powder down, seat the bullet, ram it home, bring the musket to their waist, pull back the hammer, put a percussion cap on it, and fire. Typically, a rifleman could fire about 2 to 3 well-aimed shots each minute.
Did the Union and the Confederate armies use different types of weapons?
They did, although the predominant caliber was the .58 caliber, about an ounce of lead, as I pointed out before. But the Confederacy, because of its lower industrial capabilities, imported many, many firearms from England, from other countries on the continent. Of course, the Union armies imported those too. There were probably the most used domestic firearm was a Springfield pattern made in 1861 and slightly modified in 1863.
Back to the Iron Brigade, what was their type of weapon that they used?
When they left the state, the early regiments, the 2nd, 6th, and 7th, were issued Austrian-made firearms. The men didn't like them all that much, and they preferred the Springfield, and when the brigade was finally evolved with the 19th Indiana and 24th Michigan, they were issued the Springfield rifles.
What types of new technologies came out of the war?
The new technology probably involved the repeating rifle, which is with your self-contained cartridge. Now you could just inject the cartridge instead of having to go through all of these 9 steps of loading, putting a cap on, etc. Gatling guns evolved, although they were not used that much during the war. There was a resistance to any rapid-firing firearms because of logistics involved. The more ammunition expended, the more wagon loads of ammunition you had to take to the battle site. So the generals and tacticians of the day preferred the slower firing muzzle-loaded rifle.
Back to the uniforms. Was there a difference between what the regular Army would wear and, say, a militia unit?
Militia units were pre-war. Usually the commanding officer would have uniforms of a wide variety. There were Scots who wore kilt uniforms. There were militia uniform outfits that wore French Algerian uniforms with balloon pants and fezzes. But that, by the second year of the war, all of that was not standardized exactly, but it was more homogenized, let's say.
Well, thank you very much, William, for joining us. When talking about Old Abe, that doesn't necessarily mean you're talking about the president of that time, but it does mean you're talking about a certain famous individual that came out of Wisconsin during the Civil War.
Famous individual, or the most famous personality that came out of Wisconsin during the Civil War was not even a soldier. It was a mascot called Old Abe. And some people know about Old Abe and some don't. It was an eagle, a bald eagle, that was given to Company C of the 8th Wisconsin, and they carried it on a pole into something like 27 battles and more skirmishes. And it was called the Yankee Buzzard, and the Confederates put a $500 reward on anybody who could shoot him.
A lot of regiments had animal mascots that they carried with them and served as their mascot during their time in battle. But I would say probably the most famous of all the animal mascots was Old Abe, the war eagle. That Abe was captured up near the Flambeau River, near Park Falls, Wisconsin, by a Native American. He ended up making his way to members of one of the companies that was enlisting in the 8th Wisconsin, and the men adopted him as their mascot. They carried him on a special perch. He went with the men wherever they went, with the color guard near the American flag and the regimental colors, and served 3 years with the 8th Wisconsin.
Abe comes back and becomes this big celebrity. They take him to the Centennial Convention in Philadelphia in 1876, and 100,000 people went through the Wisconsin Pavilion just to see Old Abe. And he sold these little pictures of himself that they were sold for 50 cents a piece, and the money was used for widows and veterans funding. And they taught Old Abe to put ink on his beak and peck him and autograph them. Well, those cost you more if you want to. There are so many of those pictures in existence today. I'm convinced that some guy with a pen in the back was marking them. There are also so many Old Abe feathers in collections across Wisconsin, you could make 3 eagles.
When the men mustered out in 1864, he came back to Wisconsin and lived in a special apartment in the Capitol building in Madison. He would go out, they would get Abe out, and they would take him to Veterans Day parades or Decoration Day parades. And there was a fire in the 1880s at the Capitol building. Abe didn't die of the fire, he died of smoke inhalation. So they stuffed Abe's body. He continued to live at the Capitol building until there was another fire in the early 1900s that consumed his remains. But Abe certainly lives on. J.I. Case used an eagle as their mascot. There are certain high school teams in the area that use the eagle as their mascot. And I believe it's the 101st Airborne wears an eagle patch on their uniform, and that eagle is Old Abe. So when you talk about animal mascots, certainly a lot of regiments had them, but I think Old Abe of the 8th Wisconsin was the most famous of them all.
Although Wisconsin was a fairly young state, it provided the resources and the troops needed to help defeat the Confederate South. It was heavily involved in the war effort, at the front lines and at the home front. Through Old Abe, the Iron Brigade, and more, Wisconsin has deep ties in the Civil War, and the soldiers that fought will never be forgotten.